The early story of Christianity in Scotland is inscribed not just in its manuscripts and stones, but also in its place names. This lecture will look at some key place name elements associated with the church and attempt to tease out from them something of that story. It will also look at another marker of the historical importance of religion, that of the Legion of Saints, commemorated in our namescape. Now, at the outset, I have to embarrass my colleague Thomas Clancy, because I really must acknowledge him. Thomas Clancy, Professor of Celtic at University of Glasgow. I think more than any other living scholar, he has contributed to our knowledge of the early church in Scotland, using both place names and the written record. And I think if I could have outsourced this lecture, I would have done. But also he has added an important ecclesiastical place name element to our corpus, and I'll say a bit more about that later. I'd now like you to consider these names on the screen. We've got Abernethy, mouth of the Nethy Burn, Melrose, Bear Promontory, Loch Leven, Loch of the River Leven, Rosemarkie, promontory in a territory called Markie, maybe in the Markie Burn. Now, these are, of course, some of our earliest and most eminent churches in what is now Scotland. Now, what is striking from a toponymic perspective is that none of them contains an element remotely associated with their important ecclesiastical status or function. They all refer simply to topographical features of the landscape in which they are situated. Now, this is reminiscent, and there may be something in this, I don't know, but it's reminiscent of the names of many of the earliest secular central places, which I discussed in my lecture on settlement. These too tend to be purely topographical. It's often the later or secondary settlements which use generic elements explicitly referring, well, in settlement to human habitation, or such as the Gaelic Bala or Norse Bolstadr, seen as secondary settlements from a central one with a topographical generic. Now, if something similar is going on in the ecclesiastical sphere, it may be that some names containing explicitly ecclesiastical generics, such as Gaelic Kill, a church, might imply places of worship which are later and less important compared to the major early church, the central early churches, with in some cases at least an implied dependence on those churches. Now, in analysing and interpreting place names relating to the church, it's especially important to distinguish between generic elements and specific elements, but everybody knows what that is now, so I don't have to explain. An ecclesiastical generic element usually indicates the actual presence of a place of Christian worship at the time of naming. Probably the best known is the Gaelic Kill, meaning simply a church, as in Kilmarnock, for example, the Church of St. Marnock, or its Scots equivalent, Kirk in Falkirk. So these ecclesiastical generics form a relatively small restricted group. Now, in contrast to these generics, ecclesiastical specific elements cover a much wider range of meaning. They can qualify topographical, agricultural, or settlement elements, and can tell us a bit more about the function, ownership, organisation, and dedication of a given church. But they do not tell us where that church actually lay. For example, the Gaelic Arn Prior in Menteith, meaning share of the prior, refers to the prior of Inchmahome, which lay almost 4 miles away. And in the case of Prestwick by Ayr, an Old English name meaning dependent farm of the priest, or priests, probably plural, it does not tell us where these priests were actually based. So we can also find both generic and specific elements with an ecclesiastical referent. In these cases, the specific is often the name of the saint to whom the church is dedicated. And this is especially the case in conjunction with the Gaelic generic element Kill, in such names as Kilbride or Kilmarnock, as I talked about, Kilbride being the church dedicated to St. Bridget. It should be borne in mind that a word can function both as a generic and a specific. For example, the name Kilmartin church dedicated to St. Martin, the Kill is the generic, while as in Ballinakilla, the farm of the church, or Kirktown, it's the specific element qualifying farm. So again, it's not telling us exactly where that church was. Similarly, in Orkney, we have the North Peter Kirk, the kirk dedicated to St. Peter, in contrast to which is actual kirk site, in contrast to kirkwall or kirkwa, meaning a bay characterized by a church, in this case, St. Magnus's. Now, here you can see some of the most important generic elements referring to churches in Scottish place names. We've got the Brittonic, and that covers Pictish and Northern Brittonic, Eccles, Gaelic, Ecclish, Kill, Anich, and Temple, Norse Kirkja, Scots Kirk, and Old English Chiriche. There's also a small group of elements which straddles the ecclesiastical and the secular world. In some cases, they can refer to places of worship, and other cases purely to secular objects. Now, examples of these are at the bottom there. Older Gaelic both, the modern Gaelic bow, originally a bothy or a hut, but also it can also mean a church, or Brittonic bod, and sometimes also Gaelic lawn, lan, meaning an enclosed piece of land that can also have an ecclesiastical referent. Now, one of the several big questions we can ask of ecclesiastical generic elements is whether they can throw light on the chronology and processes whereby Christianity established and organised itself in early medieval Scotland. Now, a complicating factor is, of course, my oft-repeated mantra that there was no such thing as medieval Scotland. There were several distinct polities, each with its own ecclesiastical and linguistic configuration. Now, I'll start with two of the most important elements in Scotland which refer to an early place of Christian worship, be it pastoral or monastic or both. These are the Brittonic Eccles that you saw earlier, and then Kill, Gaelic Kill, both ultimately loan words from Latin, as in fact almost all the church elements are. The Celtic languages, that almost every ecclesiastical word is ultimately a Latin loan word. So you can see the ecclesia and Kella. And the former, the Eccles, was adopted early by Brittonic speakers, the latter by speakers of Goidelic. North of the Forth, Eccles would appear to be one of the standard Pictish words for a place of worship. And so place names containing this element are unlikely to have been coined much after the 9th century. Now, both Eccles names and Kill names are almost always combined with the name of a saint. The most important discussion of Eccles, I'll just call them Eccles names, in Scotland is Geoffrey Barrow's 1982 article, The Childhood of Christianity, a Note on Some Place Name Evidence. Now, here he had a distribution map of the Eccles names, slightly amended and redrawn by myself and Pete McNiven. Now, and I should say, I'm just concentrating on former Pictland, the area north of the Forth. As the title Childhood indicates, he would see such place names as dating from an especially early phase in the conversion of eastern and southern Scotland. I think the story is actually more complicated than that. In eastern Scotland, north of the Forth, i.e. the kingdom of the Picts, I would argue that we are not seeing a simple chronological progression from a Pictish church using Eccles to a Gaelic one using Kill, although that would seem to be, politically, that would seem to be logical. The influence of the Gaelic-speaking church, originally centred on Western Scotland and above all Iona, was already being felt in some parts of eastern Scotland as early as around 600. In fact, it is quite possible that the Iona-centred church became an early vector of the Gaelic language into Pictland. I've argued on the basis of saints' names embedded in Kill names, as well as in other related place names. You can see clusters of Kill names in East Fife and in Atholl. And I have argued that they belong to the early 8th century, with a strong association with Iona. Now, given that there is evidence that at least some names using Pictish Eccles were also being coined in this century, we should probably be thinking of a coexisting, sometimes perhaps even competing, ecclesiastical networks within the kingdom of the Picts. These looked in different directions for structures of pastoral care, liturgy, and methods of organisation. One looked to the Gaelic-speaking church in the west, centred on Iona, the other to Northumbria Church in the south. Now, from written records, we know that there was political and liturgical tensions between these two blocks. We have the annal entry of 717, which states that the Pictish king Naitan or Nechtan expelled the Iona familia from Pictland across Dromalben to Dalriata or Argyll. And by familia, I mean basically all those churchmen and women who looked to Iona as their mother house. Now, these tensions crystallised around the so-called Easter question that you'll all be very, very familiar with, I'm sure. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, the Northumbrian kingdom had adopted later Roman or Petrine method of calculating Easter, while the Columban Church adhered to the older method. Now, I say Petrine because Peter was invoked as the ultimate authority for the latter method of calculation. Now, we know from Bede, writing around 730, that the Pictish king Naitan not only supported the Petrine usage, but also asked for masons to be sent from Northumbria to build a stone church, which he promised to dedicate to Peter himself. Now, Barrow has, I think, plausibly suggested that the Eccles place name Eccles Pether, Peter's Church, which I've highlighted there, refers to that very church. This is an important piece of evidence for the dating and context of Eccles names in general. The building of the Church of St. Peter and the adoption of the Petrine Easter in Pictland must have been at some point between round about 706 and 716. The exact site of Eccles Pether we don't know, but we know it was closely associated with Rhisteneth in Angus. And just to reiterate that I am only talking about Scotland north of the Forth, former Pictland. The Eccles names to the south are almost completely confined to the kingdom of Northumbria at its greatest extent and have a different story to tell, which I'm not going to tell today, unfortunately. In terms of the place name elements, Eccles and Kill, this opposition between Petrine and Columban usage should not be overstated. For example, there are figures embedded in Kill names in eastern Scotland who are associated with the introduction of the Petrine Easter into the Iona familia. I'm thinking especially of St. Doncad or Duncan, abbot of Iona, who died in 717 and under whose auspices the Petrine usages were introduced into that abbey and therefore into the whole of the Iona familia. I say especially because we seem to have two churches in Fife dedicated to this Duncan. Kilduncan, which used to be a wee parish near St. Andrews, and Kinachar, written Kilconquer, in the East Neuk, also a Duncan, a Doncad dedication. Now, I think the most striking difference between Eccles and Kill names is their distribution. Yeah, this is the, I don't know if I mentioned, the Kill map is a new map that myself and Pete McNiven have drawn up using data from, for example, Rachel Butter and Nicholl Eisen, because Nicholl Eisen's map of Kill names in the 1976 book is really quite misleading because there's a lot of Eastern Scottish Kill names that were not recorded. So that's the map you're seeing on the left there with the red dots. Now, as I say, you've got this cluster of Kill names in East Fife, a cluster in Atholl, but the whole of the Eccles zone, from the Forth in the south to the Don in the north, is almost completely Kill-free. If we accept a synchronic model for Kill and Eccles names, of these names formations in eastern Scotland, at the same time, rather than a diachronic one, one following the other, we may be looking at the emergence and trajectory of a Pictish church distinct from a Gaelic or Ionan one, from around the time of King Nechtan or Naitan in the early 8th century. Furthermore, the fact that there are no Eccles names north of Donside in Aberdeenshire may be telling us something important about the political reach of Pictish kings during the long 8th century. Now, Bill Nicholl Eisen, in that influential book I keep talking about, proposed that the element Kill was used to create place names only until the early 9th century. As we've seen, this is likely to be the case for eastern Scotland. However, it's certainly not the case in the west. As Rachel Butter points out in her important 2007 PhD thesis, Kill Names and Saints in Argyll, question mark. The full title is Kill Names and Saints in Argyll, A Way Towards Understanding the Early Church in Dalriata, question mark. There are some kill names which were coined much later. One example she gives is Kilcatrin in Cowell, now called simply St. Catherine's, founded by Duncan Campbell of Loch Awe, who died in 1453. Now here's this most recent attempt I was talking about of mapping kill names. As I say, it began with a modification of Nicolaïsen's distribution map, and as I say, it still relies quite heavily on him for some areas, but it has been enhanced and I think made more reliable by data from Butter, especially. And like so much in place name studies, it's very much a teamwork. So much of what I've been talking about in these lectures has been teamwork. The clusters in East Fife, Atholl, and around Rosemarkie, which you can also notice up just north of Inverness, another quite distinct cluster, as well as its remarkable absence between the Don and the Tay. It's very clear from these distribution maps. And there are only 2 kill names in that area between Don and Tay, and they're both right beside Brechin, and they're both medieval parishes, and they're both dedicated, one is dedicated to Mary, Kilmuir, right next to the cathedral, and then we've got Birkhill, which is a very disguised kill name, Botherkill, probably meaning the church on a road, which is just south of Brechin. And I think the Mary dedication of this kill name is particularly interesting, given that there is one of the very few early sculptured stones in Brechin, and it's in Brechin Cathedral, has got an image of the Virgin and Child. I've mentioned the incorporation of an early 8th century saint, the Donnachad or Duncan, in 2 East Fife place names. But there is quite a remarkable saint commemorated in Aberdeenshire. This is now Kinethmont. You can see how heavily disguised some of these kill names can be. Kinethmont, a parish at the western end of the Geary. Now, Alchmont, who you can see, Alchmont is the name of 2 Northumbrian saints. One died in 781, the other around 800. Now, if there's anything at all in my above suggestion that Eccles names look south to Northumbria and Kill names look west to Iona, then we might be seeing here a later kind of coming together of the 2 traditions. In a 2016 article, we're going to leave now Kill and Eccles. In a 2016 article in the Journal of Scottish Name Studies, Thomas Clancy threw another early medieval element into the ecclesiastical pot. This is the element behind the Logie names. It had hitherto been thought that Logie derived from the Gaelic lag, a hollow. But Clancy has shown convincingly that it is in fact a Pictish and or Old Gaelic loanword from the Latin locus, meaning a place, developing the meaning holy place, place of relics. And it can be compared with the Old English word stow, which also started life meaning simply a place, but soon developed to mean a place where people assembled especially for religious purposes. We have one wonderful example of this in Scotland, namely Stow in Midlothian, a place we know from early medieval records to have been important in the religious and political life of medieval Scotland. Now, it is this loch or log element that we find in names such as Logie Rate, Logie Buchan, or Logie Pert. Here you can see a map from Clancy's article. Now, the first clue as to its ecclesiastical application is that the bulk of them are names of medieval parishes, and they're shown on this map as the black crosses. The other clue is that just over half of them are qualified by the name of a saint. This has sometimes been obscured by a later qualifier. For example, Logie Buchan in Aberdeenshire first appears as Ecclesia Logan Talargi, the specific Talargi being the Pictish saint Talorgan, found also in the parish name Kiltarlety, near Bewley. Another example would be Logirate at the heart of Athol. And this first occurs as the church of Logi Mahed, the Logi of St. Coidi, or Coidi. Now, Coidi was Bishop of Iona, who died in 712. And I'm quite convinced that this is the saint embedded in this Logi name. But again, disguised, because we've now got Logi Rate rather than Logi Mahed. Sometimes the Logi name has simply lost its saint, as in Lagan on the Upper Spey, which was formerly Logi Kenny, the Logi of St. Conyach. Now, its Pictishness is strongly suggested by its distribution. However, it is not clear how it fits into the nexus of Eccles and Kill names. The evidence, fragmented and difficult to interpret as it is, points to the formation of all these names in the long 8th century. And to paraphrase Clancy, they all seem to have been the product of some sort of systematic organisational moment in the Pictish Church. I've already mentioned Logirate, whose patron saint was St. Coidi, the Bishop of Iona. Logirate, interestingly, has 4 chapels dependent on it, 3 of which contain the element kill. This helps to corroborate patterns we have seen in Fife with the cluster of kill names around the important early church of St. Andrews, as well as this dense cluster of kill names around Rosemarkie, another one of our really early church centres, and all suggesting, as I say, maybe some kind of dependency. In all these instances, there is the distinct impression that kill implies smaller units of local worship and pastoral care dependent on a central or mother church. And at least in case of Logirate, the loch or log can refer to such a central church, while other ones bore the kind of topographical names that I mentioned at the start of this lecture, Abernethy, Rosemarkie, etc. I'm going to look, before turning to some ecclesiastical specific elements, I want to look briefly at the Western Isles and what place names can tell us about the early church there. Now, there's a recent project, Iollas na Neuve, literally knowledge of the saints, which was conducted under the auspices of Keolis, the University of Glasgow, and Gaelic. You can see the names of the team, the ubiquitous Thomas Clancy, Sophia Avamam Graham, and Liam Alistair Krauss. It represents an in-depth study of the early and medieval Christian heritage of Uist, using both archaeology and toponymics, and looking at ways in which they can complement each other. As the project introduction says, an absence of archaeology does not necessarily indicate an absence of early Christian activity. End of quote. Making the point that, as we've seen also in my lecture on archaeology, place names can help fill in these absences. One of the conclusions which the project reached, and which can be extended throughout the Hebrides, is that despite all their Norse place names, there is not a single name coined with an Old Norse ecclesiastical term as a generic, although we have lots of them as specifics with the word kirkja, like Kirkedal in Uist, for example, or Kirkenish in several Kirkenishes, the Kirkness, but they're all as specifics. They're not actually using Kirk as a generic. This Kirkenish particularly is one in Tyree. In contrast, there are scores of names with Gaelic kill as a generic. Now, the basic conclusion here is that the Gaelic-speaking church maintained or even expanded its presence throughout the period of Norse settlement in the Hebrides during the 9th and 10th centuries. As I mentioned at the start of this lecture, ecclesiastical specific elements cover a much wider semantic range. They can sanctify a secular term or add an extra dimension of sanctity to an ecclesiastical one. The most widespread ecclesiastical specific is the name of a saint. Such names, we've got a wonderful name of hagiotoponyms. I think I said the other day that we love making up onomasticians love making up long words. Hagiotoponyms, a place name with a saint's name embedded in it. Now, these can tell us much, not only about local piety, but also about political and religious alliances and allegiances, including the journeying of the saints both before and after death. And I mentioned this briefly in my opening lecture, this wonderful database, Saints in Scottish Place Names. It was created about 10 years ago, and it commemorates over 750 saints, gleaned chiefly from the Ordnance Survey First Edition, and supplied with early forms and analysis. This, in conjunction with the University of Edinburgh's dedications to saints in medieval Scotland, and you can see the team there, Steve Boardman and John Davis and Isla Williamson. This means that in Scotland, which turned its back so decisively on the cult of saints at the Reformation, must have one of the best records in Christendom of its saints and their cults. The Saints in Place Name site records not only the name of the saint in a place name, but also a brief account of what we know about the saint in question. Even a quick trawl through the database will show that there are many saints whose identity we are unsure of. Furthermore, many have what are called hypochoristic names. This means names like pet names, you could say, and they appear in very different forms. A saint called Ernan, literally little man of iron, is a good case in point. The database identifies 5 different saints called Ernan, with the hypochorisms such as Ernog, Moernog, Marnog, Marnan, and Doernog, the latter occurring in Baldernock, in Stirlingshire, formerly Bothdernock. So, I mean, it makes the job of teasing out saints and even getting the basic name of the saint, let alone being able to identify the saint, extremely difficult. Now, hypochorisms such as we find with the names like Ernan are very common. And we also have evidence already in the medieval period that some of the hypochorisms developed their own separate identity and cult. Now, whatever the identity, it's important to bear in mind that the presence of a saint in a place name does not indicate the physical presence of a live saint. Rather, these names point to networks of influence and landholding, some of which can be many hundreds of years after the death of the saint in question. Now, saints' names are not only attached to ecclesiastical elements. Especially common is the agricultural element, the Gaelic dal, meaning hoch, water meadow. As such, it was a valuable resource, both for summer grazing and haymaking. Thus, a church's ownership of a dal was an important source of revenue. And to tie it so closely to a saint, to the saint of the church in question, who it belonged to, was an effective way of invoking the protection of that saint from an intrusion by neighbours. Now, the saints can range from the intensely local to the international and scriptural. Now, here, the owners of Dalpatrick in Strathearn, just south of Crieff, invoked a saint widely culted in both Scotland and Ireland, so a saint not to be messed with. There was another more local reason for invoking Patrick's protection, since we know from other sources that the nearby church of Strageath was dedicated to St. Patrick. And you can see on the slide just how close they were. Now, we don't always have such good corroborating evidence as at Dalpatrick, but it does give us more confidence in linking such like hagiotoponyms with a local church dedication, even when we have no direct evidence for that dedication, even if it's just a well or a meadow or whatever, then we can pretty confidently say that that was the patron saint of that medieval church. Now, sometimes specific elements can give very precise information about objects, activities, or offices supported by the revenue from the place in question. These are especially common with the settlement element, our old friend Pet. As we saw in Lecture 3, names in Pet are particularly associated with important early church communities, the densest clusters being around Abernethy and Dunfermline. This association is indicated also by property records. However, through certain specific elements, this association is given further precision. For example, the specific element, now modern Gaelic, leor, lever, a book, is found in Pit Liver by Dunfermline. From this we can say that the farm supported the work of a librarian, or armarius, by providing the wherewithal for the production of books. Also in Dunfermline's core lands, there was a pit Bochley, a farm whose revenue would have been earmarked for the keeper of the Bachel or crozier, a holy relic of the saint of the Mother Church. These names must be older than the church founded by St. Margaret, which developed into the Benedictine Abbey, and testify to the presence of an important religious community at Dunfermline well before the late 11th century. Returning to books for a moment, there are 3 pit names in Scotland which contain the specific soshgal, the word for gospel, loan word, one of which is lost, while the other 2 are well camouflaged. The lost one is Pitoscal, the name of a land belonging to the old church of Luthrisk in Fife. The other 2 are Pantascal in Farnell Parish in Angus, and even more camouflaged, Bantuscan by Falkirk, which was originally Petentoscal. Right, I'm going to now go back to the west coast and up to the north, by way of a very important ecclesiastical specific element which has been studied more than any other. This is the Old Norse papi, nominative plural papar, genitive plural papa. It's usually translated as priest or monk. It's found as a specific in around 30 Norse place names. As you can see from the map, based on one by Aidan MacDonald, they are almost entirely confined to the Northern Isles and the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. It is also found in Iceland and the Faroes. It qualifies a very restricted corpus of generics, by far the most frequent being the Old Norse A, meaning island, as in Pabe or Papastur. Also frequent is the Old Norse Bili, or Bili, a settlement or farm, as in Papel and Pabel. More than any other place name element, it is inspired truly in this interdisciplinary endeavour, including archaeology, toponymics, historiography, and soil analysis. The questions which drove this endeavour were, for example, who exactly were the Papar, and what was their relationship to the Norse? Were the Papar names generated through real live encounters between the incoming Norse and settled religious groups or individuals? Or was it a name given to places where there were signs of Christianity, but only signs? And if the name did arise from actual contact, what was the fate of these communities or individuals? Now, a whole book is devoted to answering these questions, edited by Barbara Crawford. And then following that came a website. Few definitive answers were forthcoming, but the whole project deepened our understanding both of pre-Norse ecclesiastical activity in the Western and Northern Isles, as well as of later Norse settlement. It also provided an in-depth survey of each of the 30 sites, bringing together all the different strands of research. Now, the logo of the project is the so-called monk stone, a carved shrine panel from Pabel in the island of Westborough, just off the southwest coast of Shetland. Here, at least, we are surely seeing churchmen whom the Norse called Papar. One of the findings of the Papar project was that Papar names are typically located in areas of fertile arable land, although there are some exceptions. Pabel in North Uist is a good example of a very favourable site. It, like Papel in Shetland, is combined with the Old Norse settlement Bili. It's Old Norse settlement term, Bili. It's moreover embedded in a wider Christian landscape. This is in North Uist. We've got Kirkbost, the Old Norse Kirkebostadr, the church farm, and immediately to the south we have Kilmuir, the Gaelic Church of St Mary. And so it's quite possible that the kirk referred to in the name Kirkebost is that in which the Papar of Pabel worshipped, while the church itself may have stood at Kilmuir and may even have been dedicated to Mary at that time. Finally, I'd like to turn to simplex names. And this is moving right away from the north and the west. And talking about simplex names, those are names just of one element. And one of my favourite is skrine. So we've jumped across to and from the Papar zone, and here we are in Angus. Here we find a large and fertile farm called Skrine. It lies in the parish of Panbride, which is a Pictish name meaning valley or den under the tutelage of St. Bridget. Her den being, of course, the deep valley which runs through the lands of Panmure, a name meaning big den, another Pictish name. Scrine represents the Gaelic screen, a shrine or reliquary, and it must have been so called because its revenue went towards the upkeep and stewardship of an important reliquary, such as an example might be the so-called Monymusk reliquary shown here. Now, Arbroath Abbey drew an annual income of 20 shillings from the lands of Scrine, so we can assume it had keeping of the eponymous screen, shrine, shortly after the abbey's foundation around 1178. However, the Gaelic name indicates that a reliquary was being supported by income from these lands before the advent of the abbey, and very possibly predating it by centuries. The reliquary itself might have contained an important relic of the local patron St. Bridget of Panbride, or St. Fechin, Latinised as Vidgeon, culted at St. Vidgeon's beside Arbroath. Now, another ecclesiastical simplex is Dysart, the Gaelic, modern Gaelic Dishurst, another loan word from Latin, and the Latin desertum, a desert or remote place. It's specifically a place to which a holy man or woman would withdraw for prayer and contemplation. The best known of these is Dysart in Fife. The early 13th century life of St. Cerf tells that the saint would spend time in a cave in Dysart, spelunca in deserto. Here is a picture of that cave, now appropriately in the grounds of the Carmelite nunnery there. It was in this cave that St. Cerf had his famous theological dispute with the devil, which of course the saint won. Now, there are other Dysarts in Scotland. There's one near Montrose, which formed part of the lands of Rhistennath Priory. Also, the medieval parish of Glenorchy in Argyll was known as Dysart or Dishurst and associated with a fairly obscure saint called Conan. There's another, I talked about a place where saints withdraw to for contemplation, and you may remember at the end of the hunting lecture, I talked about a seat, meaning where the aristocracy would sit and wait for the kill in a hunt. But there was another type of seat, a seat associated with a saint. And these were rocks, often unusually shaped boulders or piles of stones. And the Scots word for this was seat, as in the hunting term, or Gaelic suya, S-U-I-D-H-E, also meaning a seat. Now, they can appear as a simplex. For example, we've got suya in Glendochart, which can only refer to the seat or place of contemplation of St. Fillan, who dominates that glen. However, more often the saint's name is attached, for example, in the heavily disguised Southanen or Southanen in Ayrshire, the Sui of the seat of St. Finan or Finian. I think my favourite is St. Muggin's seat in Fliss parish in North Fife, containing the extremely obscure and very local saint Magridden or Macaulin. I've identified around 50 different church-related terms which have embedded themselves in our landscape in the form of literally thousands of place names, creating a surprisingly nuanced story of Christianity in Scotland over the last 1,500 years or so. As we've seen, these include names of places of worship and pastoral care, with sometimes the name being the only evidence that we have that they ever existed. As importantly, ecclesiastical elements express control of land and resources, underlining the organised church's authority. For example, saints are used as part of the defence against secular intrusion, expressing their invoking their protection and expressing it through the place name. Think of Dalpatrick that I talked about. Even minor features such as wells can function as a property marker set on the boundary of a church territory, invoking the protection of the saint. For example, we have Bridie's Well in North East Fife on the very eastern boundary of the extensive lands of Abernethy, a church dedicated to St. Bridget. We even find names being invoked as primary evidence for the church's claim to a piece of land. In Western Aberdeenshire in the 15th century, a dispute had arisen between the Bishop of Aberdeen and the Lord of Forbes over the land of Terpercy in the parish of Tullynestle. One of the lands claimed by Forbes, or Forbes, was called Lurganasbok, a Gallic name meaning literally the leg of the bishop. Leg in the sense of a long strip of land. Now, the relevant document is in Scots. You'll see it there, I quote it. The first reason the land that Forbes claimeth his, or Terra Persi, is called Lurgandaspok. That is to say, the bishop's leg, the whilk name were not likely it should have were it not the bishop's. So, in other words, it would not be called the bishop's leg unless it belonged to the bishop. You can't argue with a place name. And at the other end of the scale, we have names which simply express local piety. For example, names invoking the protection of a saint, not for any proprietorial reasons, but to protect a public resource, such as a well. Given that our venue is St. Augustine's, it just remains for me to invoke his protection and to see us all through to the end, which is nigh. Thank you.